Morning, and for those of you who are spending the day with your father, happy Father's Day. For those who are not, well, my dad died 8 years ago, so I don't have a dad to spend my Father's Day with either. So anyway, last week I just ran out of time. I was running all over the place trying to get things done before I had to disappear off on a business trip. And I just literally ran out of time. So the mystery keyboard remained a mystery, and I apologise for that. So now I have the mystery keyboard here with me now. Can you work out which one it is? Is it the one on this side or the one on this side? Well, for those of you who guessed it was this side, would be completely correct, because this is the mystery keyboard. This is what I drove north for last week to go and pick up. And for those of you who don't know what this is a Korg Oasis, okay? With Oasis standing for, and I have to look this up because I can never remember it, Open Architecture Synthesis Studio, OASYS, okay? This was made by Korg between 2005 and 2009, and as I said in the video last week, when this thing was brand new in the US it retailed for nearly $8,500, and in the UK it was £5,500 because of the exchange rate fluctuations. But it was one incredibly expensive keyboard to buy. Actually, what this keyboard should have been called was the Oasis 3. And I'll explain why. So the Korg Skunk Works, as I call them. So Korg is sort of their R&D department back in the day. I don't know what it still is, but their R&D department back in the day was split across three main points. There was this sort of R&D department that sort of existed in California. There was an R&D department that existed in Italy. And then there was an R&D department that existed in Japan. And the team that were in California was sort of like a bit like the Korg Skunk Works, if you like. They came up with some fairly radical ideas and how to push sort of the boundaries of the Korg product forward. And they were responsible for this beastie. But before they got to this beastie, what they actually did was they originally developed the open architecture concept in 1995, so 10 years before this thing saw the light of day. And what they actually did was they sort of developed this keyboard. They had a keyboard at the time, and they called it Big Blue, and there was a sort of mentions of it in the press around 95. But it never ever actually got to production. So the Oasis one never got production. Predominantly the reason for that was that the hardware of 1995 wasn't up to the task of what this thing can do. So it got shelved eventually, and 4 years later the Oasis 2 arrived. And the Oasis 2 was a PCI card that went inside a computer. And what that gave you was a 12-channel audio mixer, 32 channels of MIDI, and 24-bit I/O. So it was an incredibly powerful piece of kit. Again, this failed. Okay, it didn't really take off, and one of the predominant reasons why it didn't take off was because as soon as you start to layer the voices up on that card, the card effectively started dropping your polyphony down to sort of 2 or 3 notes that could be played. Effectively, the thing just sort of died. So they did sell some of it, but in reality it died. It wasn't a particularly great idea. And also at the same time in the background, you know, you had the sort of I can never remember the sequence of these, but you had the Trinity and the Triton, you know, as workstations that took over from the T series, and they were sort of like chugging along in the background. And people would just go and buy those because it had a keyboard and all the other stuff. So it was sort of more user interactive. Well, that's what I feel anyway. But so the Oasis 2 failed. So then they went back to the drawing board, and And what they looked at was where they thought they were going wrong with this stuff. And up until that point, manufacturers of keyboards would typically put their own proprietary chips into the keyboard that would actually make that keyboard sound. And it's one of the reasons why nowadays, you see on eBay and you see on other places, you can go and buy the ROM, the firmware upgrades for a keyboard, because what they've done is they've flashed the firmware onto a chip and then you extract the prior chip and put the new chip in, which is how upgrades happened. Well, what Korg did was they sort of took a long look at the whole sort of proprietary chip environment, and what they realised was that probably wasn't going to be the way forward. So they decided what they were going to do was they're going to effectively put a computer in one of these things, and that is exactly what this thing is. It is a PC, for want of a better word. It's a I'll give you the spec on it actually. It's a 2.8 gigahertz Pentium. It came out of the shop with a gigabyte of RAM. This one's got 2 on it. And it came out with a 40 gig hard drive in it. So, if I was to open this thing up, what I would see was a motherboard, very similar to a motherboard I would see if I opened up a desktop machine, right? Now, where they differed is what they did with this thing is they then went and put a stripped down version of Linux on it. Okay, so we tend to use, in our homes effectively Windows PCs from Microsoft, or you may have a Mac PC from Apple, and they use very different structures in terms of how they operate. So a Windows PC is obviously Microsoft Windows, and it's a very big program. You need quite a lot of horsepower to run a Windows PC just to get it going effectively. But it gives you an awful lot out of the box. You don't have to go and buy lots of things to make it do things, because it's all included as part of the operating system. Then you've got a Mac, and what Apple did many, many years ago is they dumped the old style proprietary programming on a Mac and went down a Unix route. And what a Unix route allows them to do on a Mac is it allows them to do compartmentalizing, in terms of you can have many, many programs on there and everything is compartmentalized on the machine. But you can't run, there's a bunch of generic stuff which they build into the operating system, but then there's a load of stuff that you have to go and buy. It doesn't come out of the box. And some of the features you get in Windows, you don't get in a Mac. So, you compromise something. But this is my personal view, my Mac is far more stable than my Windows machine, always has been. My Windows machine will flip out. I mean, yes, Windows 10 is much better than Windows used to be, but it's still, when it wants to do an update, it does an update, and that's it. You are sitting there for hours waiting for this thing to update. The Mac is a different beastie. And then you've got things that run pure Linux or a pure Unix system, which is what this thing does. And just to give you an idea of why that is such a cool idea, is because we use Unix I definitely use Unix at work to run industrial control systems. And industrial control systems are effectively real-time systems. They are sitting there, they are monitoring things in real time and making decisions about the state of something real time. Okay, and in part of the job I do, that is absolutely essential, hence the reason why we run everything on that side Linux, which is a Unix flavor, because we want to make sure those machines stay up 24/7, as opposed to running a Windows server, which we know has to be rebooted at least once a month, okay, for a patch update. So that's why this was such a cool idea. And then what they then did was they did something called, let me get it right, RATI extensions. Okay, what that means is real-time application extensions, and in essence what that means is this thing is optimized to run real-time. Now for music, that is a really, really cool feature, because it means that whatever is going on this computer, it is expecting to do everything real-time. The more things you load onto it, it is still expecting to do it real time. Okay, so from the starting position, this was completely optimized to music. And yes, there were other keyboards around at the time that had similar features, but nothing went this way. This was one of the first, dare I say it, computerized workstation that was really affordable to the average musician. Well, if £5,500 was affordable to the average musician. And I actually bought this off a professional musician. It's been in his studio for years, and now he's decided that because he's moving around a lot, he needs a far more mobile rig, so he decided to sell it. So he's lost my game, is the way I look at it. Anyway, this was eventually replaced. So I said this ran, they manufactured these from 2000 to 2009, and they made about 3,000 of these worldwide. Okay, and they were used by some very, very notable musicians. One of my favourites, Jordan Rudess, Keith Emerson had one of these, Pete Townsend from The Who, you know, the list goes on. I know Tony Banks from Genesis used one of these as well. You see that on one of the tours, you can see him standing behind one of these. Okay, so a lot of very famous musicians moved onto this platform. And as I say, they've sold about 3,000 of these worldwide. And I'm lucky enough that I now own one of those 3,000, because obviously they worldwide, that's a lot of places to cover. So when this came out, as I say, it took over from, I think it was the Triton Extreme was the one that they published the year before this came out. And then obviously this took over, and this ended in 2009. And then we moved on to, and I've gone to the studio yesterday, and I've got my Kronos, which is this thing here. And they moved on to the Kronos. And we're now on, I suppose, 3/4 flavours of the Kronos. So the original Kronos came out in 2011, so that was the original. Closely followed a year later by the X, which was an expanded version of the Kronos. And in 2014, this thing arrived, which was the Kronos 2. And now we obviously have a couple of different variants of the Kronos 2, and then there's the Kronos LS. I'm not quite sure whether you would class the variants and the LS as different models, or whether the Kronos 2 is still the sort of de facto model. I think the 2 is still the de facto model. And actually, I think the 2 is an extremely nice looking piece of kit. Always have done from get-go. But it's very interesting that when you look at these things side to side, very similar in size in terms of height, you know, but you can see that this beastie is far wider than this thing is. Okay, so this is a bit more compact than the other machine is. And the other thing you notice is there is actually some space on this machine here, and I do use this, is for putting my Macintosh on it. Whereas on here, and you can't see the other end of this, and I will do a video and I'll show you the keyboard in its totality, but I can't at the moment because this is heavy. This is really heavy. I'm not sure how heavy this is, but believe me, when I was lifting it, I had to go and borrow a friend's sack barrow to bring this up to the apartment because it was so heavy I couldn't lift it. So I ended up having to borrow, when I say sack barrow, wheelie barrow for those who don't understand it, to get this up, because I just could not lift this on my own. So it is a heavy, heavy machine. It could be because it's got aluminium end plates, of course, and everything else is aluminium. But it is very, very heavy. So yes, I did struggle a bit with that. Anyway, so that gives you the lineage between here and here. And I have to be honest and say, at this point, I haven't replugged this machine in to actually play it yet. I'm actually, if I'm brutally honest, I'm struggling a little bit. I never expected to win this. I never expected to go and buy another big keyboard, a big keyboard such as this. So at the moment I'm sort of struggling a little bit about where this is going to go into my studio setup, because my studio at the moment is rather full. of equipment. I'm not going to sell it, so no point in pinging me and say how much will you take for it, because it's not for sale. Forget that. I think for the time being, it's probably going to replace the T1 at home, and I'll put the T1 into storage for a bit, just so I can get my head around what this thing does. But we'll see what happens. Anyway, this thing, when it came out of the box with a number of synth engines, so it sort of started the process, because it's been carried on by this, in that it came out with an HD1 engine, which was effectively a PCM synthesizer. So that was very similar to sort of the architecture, I think, coming up from the M1, the T1, etc. Very similar idea there with PCM samples, and you ended up with almost 700 meg of samples on this preloaded from the factory. So you actually had 700 meg of samples preloaded in the HD1 engine. Then it had the EXS engine, which came in two flavors. The first flavour was various instruments, okay, and I haven't really got into what they are yet, but various instruments were included in the ESX1 engine. And the second of the variants, the ESX2 engine, was given over to grand pianos, or specifically a grand piano, okay, and I have heard that, and it is rather good. It's not as good as I think the pianos on this, but it is still good. It's phenomenal, actually. Then it had a third engine, which was AL1, and that was a virtual analog synthesizer. So pretty much all the parameters on an analog synthesizer you would had on an AL1, and it also took the polyphony count on this particular beastie up to 96 notes, which is pretty spectacular. So you can actually layer one AL1 sound on top of another AL1 sound on top of another AL1 sound, and you could do that a number of times before you actually sort of got down to, unusable. It then had a CX3 engine, which is a tone wheel organ, okay, a STR1 engine, which is plucked string instruments, again, not got into those, a LAC engine, which stands for Legacy Analogue Collection, LAC1, and that effectively again was split into two flavours. One was a Poly 6 flavour and one was an MS20EX flavour. Okay, so two of Korg's legendary synthesis engines there underneath that one. And the last one was a Mod 7 engine, which was a semi-modular approach to synthesis on this thing. So sort of really taking sort of that modular idea of plugging bits into the circuitry. That's what the Mod 7 was around, and you could do PCM, variable phase models, wave shaping, ring modulation. There was a number of things you could do with that on here, effectively as separate modules to producing a tone. What's really interesting about that, though, is that they did that for this machine, and then when they went to the Kronos, they effectively, the HD1 moved across, the ESX engine moved to something called an SGX engine, which is where the Berlin Grand is on this. The CX3 moved across, the AC1 moved across. The LAC was split, and they only moved the MS20EX across onto this as part of the base architecture. The Mod 7 moved across, and the string STR1 moved across. So pretty much what was on here was updated and moved onto this machine here, which again is another Linux box. So this was I haven't got the specs to hand on this, but it was an updated version of this. So whatever the Pentium chip was that went into this is an update of the Pentium 4 chip that went into this. So this would have been a Pentium Pro something or other. So as you can see, over the years, the Korg have started this lineage. So the question is, how much more have we got on the Kronos? So this only got effectively 4 years of life out of it. The Kronos is now still being sold, and here we are 2018, so this is now got 7 years of life, with the latest incarnation being about 4 years old. We shall see. So going back to this thing here. So So there was a short interruption there. I'm not quite sure why. The video camera just stopped mid-flow. So going back to this keyboard, this is a full 88 key keyboard. They only ever made these in two flavours, a 76 and an 88. The 76 being a semi and the 88 being more of a full weighted keyboard. Of course, the Kronos they've made in three flavours, a 61, a 76 and an 88. Which I think was probably the right thing to do for the Kronos, because a lot of people sort of like, don't need the full 88 keys for a second board. So 61 was quite a good idea. This I don't think was ever intended to be a second board at all. This was always a primary board. It has also, which you can see here, a 10.4 inch touchscreen on it. Now apparently there is a rumour that the reason why it ended up with a 10.4 inch touchscreen on it is because the founder of Korg walked into a meeting in Japan when they were discussing the specification for this thing and basically said, screen too small, make it bigger. And that's the reason why the 10.4 came. Now the 10.4 screen is actually hinged, okay, so there is a hinge mechanism down the bottom here. And apparently that is a weakness on these keyboards. So I will need to watch that. I mean, I don't intend to gig this machine, so when it gets eventually into position, that's probably where it's going to stay. But the hinge areas on these is said to be a bit of a weakness, so we'll have to watch for that. But it is a 10.4 inch screen. It is fully touch sensitive, and probably one of the things they did was because they've used their own Korg OS on top of a Linux kernel. They've effectively maximised what they can use that screen for, which is really quite good, rather than trying to shrink or expand a Windows or a Mac screen. So there we are, the Korg Oasis, a keyboard I never ever thought that I would own. A keyboard I am extremely happy that I do now own. I am not, as I said, I am not sure what I'm going to do with this thing. It's nice to be in that position, actually, not sure what you're going to do with it. I'm not going to move this out of the studio because I use this far too much. And when I went down to unplug it, I sort of thought to myself, should I really unplug it and bring it in to do this piece? But I thought, well, it was probably worthwhile because you see some of the differences. Now, one of the things I do like about this is the fact that this screen does actually allow you to sort of tilt it to various angles depending on whether you're standing or sitting in front of the keyboard. That makes this very, very interesting, very user-friendly actually, very, very user-friendly. That was my only complaint when I got the Kronos actually, is the fact that the screen, the pitch of the screen is set by the angle of the keyboard. And there is a scenario where if you're standing right up on the keyboard itself, the screen is actually slightly hard to read. Now, whether that's because I wear glasses, and not all the time when I play do I wear glasses, I have contact lenses sometimes, but definitely when I wear glasses, I find that is not appeasing to me. If I'm standing back from the keyboard, it's more palatable, but if I'm right up on the keyboard for whatever reason, so if I was playing a tier above and I was looking down at the keyboard, that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. This you can vary the angle. Having said that, would you be playing a keyboard on a tier above this? No, because you wouldn't get a keyboard on a tier above it because you'd have to have so much clearance for the screen. It swings and roundabouts really, isn't it? So, there we go, an Oasis. I apparently have, just looking at this, I have machine number 413. So I had the 413th machine that was manufactured. So I don't know when it was manufactured, it doesn't tell me when. It also has been between A and B. This was originally a 130 volt machine, oh sorry, a 120 volt machine that has been upped to 240. And I know it's 240 because I had it plugged into 240, so that's fine. But it is actually on the back here, it's rated at 120 volts. Very interesting there. So I will probably crack this open at some point and just have a quick shifty at the transformer just to make sure there's nothing untoward in there. The other thing that's really interesting about this, and as I say, I will do a piece more thoroughly about showing you all the bits and bobs on this, is there is a blanking plate here. And I have it under good authority that actually underneath that blanking plate is a VDU output for plugging an external VDU into this thing. Now apparently the base operating system, that didn't work, but whether on the last operating system that was released for this, they made adjustments to make that work. But the facility is there, as is the facility for two, there's two USB 2s there and two USB 2s there, which again, in the base OS, weren't supported. But I have it on good authority in a later OS, they were fully supported, because there is no SCSI interface on this box. So there's no way of actually plugging in SCSI drives to this and reading those. Korg didn't do that, but if they could support USB 2, then we've probably got a way forward on that for doing some stuff. Anyway, that is the mystery keyboard. Keep safe. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye. So this is the point in the video where I turn around to you and say, if you enjoyed the contents of this video, please give it a thumbs up. It allows other people to find this content more easily that you have enjoyed. I'm sure by now, if you didn't like the content of the video, you've probably given me a thumbs down, but I'd prefer if you didn't. If you'd like to be notified about when I post additional content to this channel, somewhere about here should be the subscription icon. So please click on there and subscribe to the channel. Over here should be other content that you may enjoy that I've already done or posted to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again.